So as many viewers of the channel will know, our great friend Jujimufu, friend of the channel, has recently spoken, no we don't know Juji, but recently on his channel, Juji has been talking about his deadlift and his goal for reaching a 700 pound deadlift.
For the past few months I've been trying to get a 700 pound deadlift. I've been doing a very poor job of reaching my goal. This is unfortunate.
We both watch an old Juji video from time to time. Really enjoy Juji, especially since he's just back to Juji again. And he's been talking about reaching his goal of 700 pounds. He missed 700 pounds at competition. And a lot of people aren't that great at deadlifting, was what Fitz said. Not in those words, but that's mostly what he said.
I did not say that.
He said something similar. We wanted to use, because there's a lot of training footage and information of Juji out there recently. He's talked a lot about what he's doing for his deadlift. He's talked about kind of what his plan is going forward and what he's doing in the train at the moment. We thought it'd be a really useful educational tool to talk about what we would do with his deadlift and why some of the stuff that he's doing now might not be great. Now, just as a caveat, before someone goes, before someone says something like that, it's just an educational tool. I'm sure Juji's getting great help. There's plenty of people who could help him get a better deadlift. But as a teaching tool for people watching, I think it's a great example of, it's a very popular example. A lot of you will have seen of that stuff. So it's a great way of teaching or getting across some points in context. So teaching programming is great. Teaching correct technique is great. But things work a lot better in context. So we're just going to run through a couple of points. Some of the stuff that we think is holding Juji back on his deadlift.
In general, Juji is an incredibly talented athlete. He's super strong, so he has, like, we see him doing safety bar squats up around 700 pounds, but like really, really heavy squats. He has deadlifted heavy before in the past. He hasn't done 700 pounds. He's obviously in sick shape. Morphologically, he's pretty well disposed having a big deadlift, right? So he has longer legs to torso proportions. His torso is quite short. He has pretty long arms, so he should be able to deadlift a lot of weight considering his squat is so strong. One of the main things you're going to see with Juji is the fact that he's using a huge amount of auxiliary exercises and looking at different places or looking for different things. Like, something he always says in his videos is like he just needs to try something for long enough to see if it's going to work, which granted makes a lot of sense. What we're going to look at is a slightly different approach where we'll talk about what we would do with his programming, then what we would do with his actual technique, like how he's approaching the deadlift, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
So you'll have seen a lot of our kind of principles with Hayden. You'll see a lot of how we progress through his training. Hayden is about 80 odd kilos and he's closing in on he's not that far in his career from a 700 pound deadlift. So someone like Juji, obviously, first thing, he doesn't need to gain a lot of weight. He certainly doesn't need to gain more muscle. There's a couple of simple things he could probably start with. First of all, if we were to go with Juji's technique, essentially Juji's technique is all upper body, it's all back. He is essentially zero leg drive in his deadlift. So if you look at his deadlift, essentially his legs are at a very minor incline. My fingers are a great example for this. These work really well. So essentially the angle behind his leg, so from his calf to his hamstring, is a very open angle. It's very, very close to 180 degrees. So it's a very straight line. And essentially what this does is it's mostly hamstrings and a lot of upper back and lower back pulling that deadlift. And if you watch where Juji fails his deadlifts, it's straight off the ground. So if you watch where he failed that 700 pound deadlift, Juji failed to get it going off the ground. That's a huge issue for him. So what you would want to do is very, very simply is lower his start position down. Just get a little bit lower. So essentially more flexion in the knee, get more quad increment, engage off the ground. So that's something weightlifters will often do very well, is their first pull will be very, very strong, sometimes to the detriment of a weightlifter. But for a deadlifter, you want to be engaged, so you're flexed, your legs are pushing against the ground, so obviously your upper body is still pulling, but your lower body is pushing against the ground and it's pulling the bar with it. And then you will stay in this kind of flexion, so we'll try to keep our knees forward as much as possible to keep an even distribution between our upper and lower body, but we're still driving hard with our lower body into the ground. So we're going to make use of every single muscle Juji has. Now Fitz just mentions that he has a 700 pound safety bar squat we're talking about, quite narrow, reasonable depth. So obviously Juji's legs are very, very strong. He's very explosive. He's obviously tricking, anabolic acrobatics, whatever that is. He has a huge amount of leg power and leg drive, so it's something he should be making huge advances of, and something he could use very, very easily if he just adjusted his technique a little bit. Do you want to talk about his dynamic start?
I think that's what I was just coming up with that. A really good place to go after that, when you look at adjusting a start position, another one of the major faults he has is he has a quasi-dynamic start. So a dynamic start, like basically starting the lift off or prior to the bar breaking the floor, your body is in motion. This is something all weightlifters, all powerlifters will have kind of played around with in the past. Why I call it a quasi-dynamic start is, well, what's happening in Juji's case is Juji is unloaded, so he's under no tension during his dynamic start. This is non-ideal, right? So the main advantage a dynamic start gives us is its activation of the SSE, like your stretch shortening cycle. So in the same way, whereas if I want to jump as high as possible, I'll do a pretty quick dip and drive and I'll be able to jump nice and high for a vertical jump. If I just sat in that squat position for a few seconds, I wouldn't have an activation of that stretch shortening reflex, and then I wouldn't be able to jump as high. So when we look at how Juji sets up for the bar, he walks up, he kind of gets himself semi-rigid in the upper body, then he just drops down, so he hinges at the hips, and he grabs the bar and starts pulling it immediately. Although that will appear like you get a certain triggering of the stretch shortening cycle, and you will get a certain activation of those muscle tendon units, it's not going to be the same level of activation as if Juji was to set up, become rigid, take the slack out of the bar. So you'll commonly see deadlifters, like if he was to engage his legs a bit more, you commonly see deadlifters pushing their knees forward. You'll see the bend coming into the bar, and then they will do a dynamic dropping into the bottom position. The use of that stretch shortening cycle under tension, and that combined with additional leg drive from having lower hips, I think is really, really going to help with Juji's first pull in the deadlift. And like we've seen him do rack pulls of some crazy heavy weights. Obviously he owns a company called Grip Genie. I really, really do think like the combination of just those two things is going to allow him to have an absolutely gigantic deadlift.
So the next thing that I think is a very key issue with Juji's deadlift and some of the issues that he is having is his approach to programming. So there's kind of two avenues that we would have an issue with here that we'll go down in a second. So the first one would be is Juji does this kind of thing which you do see some powerlifters using. It's like go for a heavy single and then drop back and do some drop sets. Now in our experience and for the deadlift in particular, now this doesn't work great for most lifts to be honest, but especially does not work for a very high fatigue lift like the deadlift. So rather than putting yourself in a specific time point in your program with a destination and specific avenues and modalities that you're training at each one of these points, Juji is just going for this thing where we see loads of people spend way too much time at, and that's at a time where they are doing too much of a strength phase. Now the lines between a volume and a strength phase do kind of blur into each other, and they're not always just as distinct as you see from our videos with Hayden. But Juji, would, from what it looks like, again obviously we're just trying to use things as best we can from the videos, is he spends too much time in an absolute strength phase. Like he says, he goes for a heavy single and then drops back, and we know that this just does not work no matter how much anabolic acrobatics you are practicing. So what we would really like to see Juji, and if Juji came to us and was like, lads, I need you to help me to get 700 pound deadlifts, and we'd be like, Juji, no fucking problem. We would put him in particular phases of training. So we would take a big step back and use the place where he should be and then work accordingly up to 700 pounds. So very often we do see athletes fear losing touch with these heavier weights, and they think, well, if I haven't touched a single in 6 weeks or 2 months or even 3 months, they're mind blown. They're like, Jesus, I need to practice them, I'm getting weaker. What we'd really like to see Juji do is take a big step back in the weights. What often happens is the higher you and the longer you stay at these higher weights, the more fatigue you accrue, and you don't actually get any better. You don't get any positive compensation. You end up just accruing a lot of fatigue, not getting worse, not really getting better. Juji's obviously a very talented individual. He takes his training very seriously, so his ability to recover is very, very high. So his ability to stay at this high weight for a long time is very, very impressive, but he's not really in a scenario where he is building up any momentum. He's constantly going for heavy weights. He's constantly going for a heavy single. that kind of daily max he talks about doesn't really work well for deadlifts. It doesn't work great for squats, and it works sometimes for that, but for deadlifts it particularly does not work. You always want to take a little bit step back from deadlifting. So you'd like to see Juji remove himself from that heavy fatigue, do some higher volume at lighter weights, maybe do some stuff like really drill in that technique for a little period of time, accrue a lot of volume at those actual deadlift weights, not with the accessories, and then build up into those weights and peak to a certain event.
I think Garth brings up a good point there about the accessories as well. So obviously, Juji is a big fan of kind of variation, novel variations. A lot of us will know Juji because of these kind of really off the wall, like wearing a horse mask while doing a somersault while on fire and then going into a splits. But in this case, when it's in search of a really specific goal, that's not ideal. So in some of the recent videos, we'll see things like a belt squat deadlift. We'll see like a GHD that's being banded that he's doing like isometric holds on. We'll see isometric holds at mid shin or below the knee. And we get it. Like a lot of these things are just kind of a plaster or a band-aid you throw over a wound, right? It's a quick, short, discrete intervention that you hope will fix a certain technique issue. In the case of Juji's technique issue, where it's like a massive change that needs to be made from anterior to posterior balance, those kind of things aren't ideal, right? So in the case of the belt squat deadlift, you can kind of see what he's getting at. Like he's taking fatigue off his back. He might be putting more load onto his legs, even though in the reps we see he's not really doing that. What we'd much prefer is if we took all of that accessory work away, we then start prioritizing, do a simple needs analysis, see what accessory work Juji needs, sees what accessory work you actually need to maintain a healthy spine, a healthy back, and a healthy midline. And then prioritize all of that work that Owen's talking about, right? Prioritize actual deadlifting, actual squatting, actual strength training, and just use that to kind of the last 30% or the last 40% of our total training volume in the accessory work itself. The second problem that comes around from all of this different accessory work is you'll often see Juji pointing to an exercise and saying, I'm isolating this, like he talks about, I can really feel my erectors or I can really feel my glutes on that one. And like having that kind of mind-muscle connection. To be honest, in strength training, that is not ideal. So in Juji's case, Juji's not relearning, but he's relearning a technique for the deadlift. And he needs to be thinking about this as an entire lift. This compound lift is just one thing away on its own. In the same way where you're doing a snatch or a clean and jerk, you don't want to be thinking about like just fast elbows in the snatch lockout. You want to have a total technique. You want a kind of single track mind as you're going up to it, not this kind of separate activation of different muscle groups as you go through. So to finish off this video, as kind of Owen said at the start, right, this is mainly for watchers of the channel to understand how we go about changing people's technique, how we go about getting people to achieve a goal. And this is very much for the sake of everybody else and not really Juji. Juji, if you want us to coach you and if you actually want to deadlift 700 pounds, myself and Owen are willing to make a bet with you right now that if you give us your programming for 8 weeks and you just let us tell you what to do, we guarantee you'll deadlift 700 pounds. And if you don't, we'll do a total of 8 minutes in an ice bath.
I don't want to do that. For everyone else, there's a 10-week deadlift program that people run. It's 2 sessions a week. It's very, very simple. It's on the website. I'll leave a link down below. It's a great program, 10 weeks, just for your deadlift and accessory with that, and you will be set and home straight for a PB deadlift.